I've talked about women before in a variety of ways, but what I want to talk about today is women with power and how that works. But before I launch into that, I will now actually turn back to my partner in crime, Grace, who will describe the rules of the game.
Yes, we are delighted to have you with us. And just some notes. Again, this is we are the National Council for History Education. You can check us out at ncheteach.org. We have lots of other wonderful resources there. But we're very excited to have you with us this morning, and we want to make sure you can participate. So if you do have questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A section. That will make sure that I see them and that I get them to Joanne. We
I'm
have a
going
very
to
active.
interrupt you for one sec before you finish the rules of the game. I don't know if we're on Facebook.
I am working on it right now.
Okay.
I actually can't see you because I have face. There we go. I'm hitting go
Oh,
live.
okay. Because I see
Yes,
we're recording.
we are
And
preparing to
here we
live
are.
stream.
Now we're on Facebook. Welcome, Facebook. Okay, I'm sorry. So
Fantastic. Oh
we
no,
talked
that's
about putting things on Q&A.
yes. So put your questions in the Q&A. Again, this is we're delighted to be here at the National Council for History Education. For those of you just joining us on Facebook, put your questions in the Q&A. By all means, participate in the chat. Remember that this is a family show, so keep that nice and appropriate and on topic. But I think we'll hand it to Joanne, and we're so excited to talk about women in politics today.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'm going to, as I always do, move chat out of the way because then I just want to talk to you guys. And I need to say other things before I can talk to you guys. Okay, so as I suggested a couple of minutes ago, really what inspired this discussion of women and political power and how they've maneuvered that over the years was the fact that although intellectually I knew that Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi would be sitting on the speaker's podium behind President Biden when he gave his congressional address, I knew that intellectually, and despite that, when I saw it, I got sort of teary. I was like, look at that. It's like these two women there. It struck me in a way that I didn't, I guess emotionally, I wasn't predicting a response. And I had an emotional response to that. And I think part of that had to do with the side of it and the fact that we hadn't seen that before. Part of it, I think, had to do with the fact that it meant so much. And by this point in time and history, it shouldn't, like we should have gotten here a long time ago. So I think I was partly like rejoicing and partly acknowledging the meaningfulness of it. And then some part of me was responding to the fact that, wow, think of where we are in time and American history. And this amazing thing is happening now for the first time. And some of the images, there was an image circulating online. If you haven't seen it, go find it, of Kamala Harris walking into the House or walking towards the House chamber, striding. I mean, just her posture. And behind her is a trail of men. It's the most striking image. So go find it if you haven't seen it. At any rate, all of these things are the things that made me think about not discussing just women today, but women with actual political power. What they do with it or how they use it or whether they've acknowledged that they have it or whether others have acknowledged that they have it, and some of the complications that's presented in the past. Now, the framing assumption, and this will be a surprise to no one, is going back to the time period I write about most often, right? So the late 18th century, even the early 19th century. The framing assumption about women and political power is women don't have it, right? So that was just the given. But even on a higher level, you had first ladies, you had Martha Washington, you had Abigail Adams. The assumption, although these were women, and in the case of Abigail Adams, a very outspoken woman with real strong political opinions, who actually spoke and engaged with and advised her husband, and I'll come back to her in a minute. She actually also very concretely engaged in politics in a really interesting way, but in a covert kind of a way. But so women have always been there. What have they done? How has that worked? Well, in the case of Martha Washington, they were so convinced that she had no political interest, no political power, and there would be no way that she could do anything, that I remember finding a letter when I was researching my first book, and it was one man somewhere in among the political elite in 1790, I believe, to another man among the political elite. And what they were talking about was they should use Martha Washington as a spy at presidential functions, because no one would ever assume she was listening to or thinking about anything political that went on around her. So she would be perfect because she could go anywhere and sit anywhere, and she would just be seen as this, cipher sitting there and not hearing or responding to anything. And how handy would that be? Obviously, when I saw that letter, I thought, how striking that these men assume, and how true, right? That no one's going to say, wait, the president's wife. It's like right here. They didn't actually ultimately ask Martha Washington to be a spy. Neither one of them wanted to be the person to make that suggestion. That was wise, because that was, in many ways, a problematic idea, in part just about what it assumes about Martha Washington. But she wasn't inherently interested in politics in the degree to which other women in this time period and shortly after were. And Abigail Adams is a great example of a woman who had political power. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the geography of power, that there is a geography of power, and some women are close to the center of that landscape, and Abigail Adams was one of them. And she wanted to have political influence, and it wasn't like she was saying, I need political influence. She wanted to advise her husband. She had political ideas and attitudes. He consulted her in a variety of ways all the time. So that was a particular, a special marriage, a special partnership in some ways. But she was someone who, despite the fact that her husband was fine with it, that she was interested in it, that some people even said, at some point, I found a letter, Newby is agreeing ardently. You might not hear him, but he's peeping up here, my rescue parakeet, for those who don't know. That some people called Abigail Adams a better politician than her husband. They were jokingly saying that, but still, there was the recognition of the fact that she was engaged in politics. The most striking example of that was something that I found in the Adams, it's actually called the Adams Family Papers, and whenever you say Adams Family, you just think of TV. But the Adams Family Papers, and I was looking through stuff during Adams' presidency for my first book, and I came across a letter from Abigail, or I guess it was a letter and then a document that was not explained. It was just a document, and it looked like a script. Mrs. A, Mr. J, Mrs. A, Mr. J. So I, of course, how can you not look and see and investigate what that is, which I did. What it ended up being was Abigail Adams sat next to Thomas Jefferson at a dinner right around the time when things were beginning to heat up for the election of 1800. And she was grilling him, but she was doing it in the most polite and indirect way. And she would put her questions down, right? Mrs. A, so Mr. Jefferson, what do you think of blah, blah? And then Mr. J, she would record what he said. Now, of course, she's obviously not doing that while she's sitting at the table, but she had this whole conversation. And when you read it, you can see she's trying to find out which members of Congress he's closest to. She's trying to find out his views on what's going on in France at that particular moment. I mean, she's really pumping him for information. And then she wrote this all down and she sent it to John. And so to me, that was remarkable in a lot of ways. First of all, it's just amazing when you find evidence of unexpected evidence of politics in action on a human dimension, on a ground level, human kind of a way, and in particular with people who are not white men. So in and of itself, I just loved this piece of evidence, but so interesting because she was very engaged in that conversation. She knew what to ask, and she was asking it and then reporting it. I have no idea what Jefferson thought of that, except that when you read his answers, he's being very cagey. So she asks something about members of Congress and does he know them or not? And I can't remember the exact response, but it's something like, I know a good many members of Congress, great bunch of guys, those members of Congress. So he's actually being a savvy politician. I'd have to go back and look to see if he leaked any information, but what it reads like is Abigail trying really hard and Jefferson dodging left and right. But still, what an interesting document of a woman just just engaged in the political process. And that's going on among women with power throughout this time period. Now, again, I'm talking about, in a sense, the geography of power. So these are women who have power. In some cases, some of the women I'm talking about today, because their husband became president, that puts them on the landscape of power, and then they can act on that landscape, behave on that landscape, and shape that landscape however they and their husband see fit and what they think is proper. And different people do that in different ways. Different women do that in different ways when you're going back in time and looking at the early 19th century. There's a book by Catherine Allgore called Parlor Politics, which talks about this a good amount. She starts with Jefferson's presidency and talks a lot about Dolly Madison. She's also written a book about Dolly Madison. And the book talks about some of the things I'm referencing here, and which is, you can see, for example, you can see Dolly Madison very aggressively trying to shape a style of governance. And style is a seemingly frivolous word, but it shouldn't be, because when you're founding a nation and creating a small r republican style of government, a republic in a world of monarchies, what does that look like? And how is there enough pomp in a republic to hold, so the nation can hold its head up on the international stage, but not so much pomp that it's going to seem monarchical? So Dolly Madison was very skillfully, I haven't had enough coffee yet, guys, manipulating that terrain. That's part of what Catherine talks about in her book. But she's very political. She's deliberately political. She is creating an American style of governance, and she's doing it in a way that accords with her sense of the relationship between government and the people, and also her husband's sense. But she's a political actor for sure. There's no question about it. But again, at the time, did everybody realize that? Probably not. People did notice what she was doing because she was very flamboyant in her own style. She really had a presence. She was not shy at all about who she was and what she was doing. But still, she was a political actor in ways that for a long time, I think certainly historians didn't notice. And at the time, people did not all necessarily think about how aggressively political she was. John Quincy Adams's wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, another in a chain of women who were on that landscape of power, close to the center of power and that geography of power. And in her case, she too was actively political, but again, in a sort of behind the scenes, helping her husband way. Now, in their case, John Quincy Adams was not great with like schmoozing with the public, right? John Quincy Adams is not a schmoozer. If you've seen pictures of John Quincy Adams, there are photographs of him towards the end of his life when, photography first comes into its own. There's no schmoozing happening with John Quincy Adams. And I've managed to say that word 3 times, which makes me happy. But Louisa Catherine Adams was much better at human engagement and the sorts of things that John was not so good at. So they were a really effective team and worked that way in a deliberate kind of a way, where she was supplementing some of the things that he couldn't do. So the larger message that I'm offering here is just women have been engaged in the political process on a high level, have been engaged in presidential politics for a long time, but also what they've had to do for a long time is not act like they were, not talk like they were. And if you've read Catherine's book, there's a lot of, this is very typical in any woman in this time period talking about politics. Before they talk about politics in letters, they'll often say something like, well, I don't know anything about politics and I don't dirty my hands in it at all, but I hear that. And then they go on and say what they would like to say without having to pretend that they have no political interest, knowledge, or ambition of any kind. So there was a mask that you had to wear in some ways, even if you were the first lady. But it's important to realize it was a mask, and that women could be ambitious and women could have aggressive political ideas and intentions that they were acting with, sometimes in accordance with her husband, sometimes not so much. I mean, in the case of Dolly Madison, I believe, if there was a political fight or problem brewing, sometimes that could be resolved on the sort of nether scale of politics. So in other words, she could insert herself because she wasn't a politician per se, and on a personal level as a woman sort of put herself in a situation, and other women could come to her and say, my husband is in trouble or whatever. There was a level of negotiation in politics that actually she had that men didn't have. So there was even added political clout of a kind that I'm sure men knew was there, but that they couldn't access that because their power was so blunt and in everyone's face. And what's interesting about that is that that was a really real kind of power recognized by some men as being threatening, which it could be, right? Because that kind of power, which is based on seeming lack of ambition and a woman being able to sort of engage with people in a way that isn't necessarily political or seemingly so. Jefferson, for one, and I wish I didn't have time this morning to go and look for the date of this, but he writes a letter in which he says something along the lines of, what's really dangerous in France is these women. These women can go between the cracks in the political process, and they can talk to people and do things and get away with things that men can't. And that's dangerous. He really clearly, as much as he loved France and he liked the idea of the French Revolution and what it represented and the spark of liberty spreading around the world, he was not thrilled with women at all in the public or political realm. And France, that really, really bothered him about France. And he talked about it actually more than once, and even told American women, some of them women with very strong political attitudes who, in one case, were holding a sort of salon, where she would invite people of importance, political and otherwise, and engage in conversation. Jefferson actually would say to these people, American women know better than to do that sort of thing, right? They know that their real place is with their children, is, near the cradle. Like that's what women should really be doing. Now, in this time period, I'm sure many of you who've read at all about women in this period, and whenever I last talked about women, I mentioned Rosie Zagari's book, Revolutionary Backlash. And that is, there was this idea that was like ultimately a compromise idea to represent the fact that women had power, but it was a very particular kind of a power. And that's the idea of Republican motherhood. There was this idea, and it wasn't necessarily called that at the time, but the idea behind it was that in a republic, mothers have a very important political duty to stay at home and help with the education of their children and help raise good Republican citizens for the future. So the argument was like, that's politics, and it's vital because the republic can't survive without properly educated citizens who understand what a republic is and its vulnerabilities and are virtuous enough to uphold the republic. So Republican motherhood was seen as something political, but it was very well defined, right? Republican motherhood, even if it was being a Republican wife. And there are different scholars who've written about this in a different way. Regardless, that's still a very defined role. So that's actually an attempt to bound in some of what I'm talking about here among very high power holders. And there are all kinds of attempts. When I was thinking today about what I wanted to say, one person who came to mind, and she isn't or wasn't necessarily a power holder as far as a position of political power herself, but she certainly had power, was Mercy Otis Warren, who was a writer, a playwright, and wrote a history of the American Revolution while the people were still around who were engaged in and fought and led the American Revolution. I was going to include her, then I didn't because she wasn't in the kinds of positions of power that I was talking about, but I do actually want to include her because what's interesting is it's another example of women doing something that in and of itself doesn't seemingly have to be seen as a power grab, but boy, it was, and men responded. So she wrote this history of the revolution, And she said a lot of things about what she thought and about what had happened. And she highlighted some people and she didn't give as much credit to some people. She was doing what she thought the story was. She wasn't necessarily trying to make a huge political point. But John Adams, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone who knows John Adams. John Adams felt that she was being inaccurate and she wasn't giving him his due credit. And he responded and he argued with her. And they really got into an argument. It starts out kind of semi-friendly and it ends up not being so friendly, and she ends up having to contact another man to ask him how to deal with the situation, because it's very clearly become a matter of personal honor, and Adams somehow feels insulted, and this is not a realm in which she has had to operate before as far as men and honor and anger and insults and the public. So it's fascinating because society itself, just the customs, the way things work in a way bound her in, or risk bounding her in, because she's suddenly in a situation where you can see in the letter she's writing, she's like, I don't know what do I do? Do I do anything? Should I get a guy in here? Maybe he should talk to Adams. It shows you the degree to which there were lines drawn. And even if women weren't being blatantly blocked out, boy, you felt blocked out because you were engaged suddenly, in her case, in a conversation of a sort that she really had not engaged in before. So all of this is to say that women were ambitious, women had positions of power, they were on the landscape of power, they engaged in politics, they had a political influence on the government and what was happening in the government, they advised their husbands. All of this was happening in a far more potent way than we often acknowledge. And seeing those women up on the speaker's platform was a reminder of how much and how long women have had to mask power when they have it. That it's so threatening, and you can sense the threat of it by the fact that everyone responded to seeing them up there, right? Like there's a power to that. And this is not a new idea, right? That representation matters. That when you see that something is possible, it becomes possible to people, particularly young people who are looking on, right? They see that and they know that they can do that. I've had young girls say that to me over the years, that they saw me on TV and I'm a woman historian kind of holding forth on history, and they want to be a historian. And how often, maybe they got to see Pauline Mayer. There's there's not oodles of us, there are a good number of us, but a number of years ago, there weren't oodles of us. And here are these little girls who are like, I could do that. Like, I could do that. And it's not that they didn't necessarily know that they couldn't do it before. It just didn't even occur to them. So it's almost a cliche. It's said so often that representation matters, but it does. And in a way, my emotional response to Wednesday night was a great example of that. Another way in which representation matters, and it's the last thing that came to me when I was thinking about women and political power and ways in which they are or aren't allowed access to it, or ways in which they don't have access to it that you don't realize because the norm is so firmly grounded in men having power. I interviewed Tammy Duckworth for Backstory. And I don't know, at this point, it's like a year, 2 years. I don't know how long ago it was. It was a while back. And it was a great interview, and she's fascinating to talk about. And I loved the whole thing. But at some point towards the end of the interview, I said to her, if a magical being appeared in front of you and said, you can do anything you want regarding Congress, anything, what would be that thing that you would magically do? Like no restrictions, just you could do it, poof, you would be allowed to. And her response was putting more women and people of color in positions as chief of staff in Congress, because very practically speaking, chiefs of staff pick agendas, right? See things that are important or unimportant and put those things in front of the member of Congress who they are working for. And, it's a very obvious idea, but it was sort of wonderful to hear her say it. She's like, the fact of the matter is, women being chiefs of staff are going to notice something about childcare that matters that a man might not think is important. You know, people of color are going to notice things that have to be addressed now that, you know, maybe a white man wouldn't notice. So it was another way, another idea of the thought that representation matters. In that case, representation meaning honest to goodness, you know, like political representation. It matters so much. And Wednesday night, for me, and I'll bet for a lot of you out there, was kind of a reminder of that. And a reminder of the fact that women have long exercised political power. The question is, what disguise did they have to assume so that they could do it and actually have some kind of an impact? Okay, we are at the point where I believe it is my time. I'm going to open chat now. My time to stop talking. Oh, and the mug. I know Carolee was going to appear and tell me that I need to show my mug. Okay, so, and this mug, this is the totally logical mug for me to have right now that relates to I know, Carolee's like, Joanna's well trained. I know, Carolee, you're going to say mug. Okay, I'm going to explain the mug. Pomp and Crest for the Door 89. So this comes from one of our past episodes about women and political power, right? Someone is like, Pomp and Crest. What that comes from is there was a genre of newspaper essay in the early part of the early republic, the government first started, that was like fear and panic of women having political power, because during the revolution, they had power, more political power than they might have had before in a recognizable way. And then the government starts, and there's clearly big question marks for men about what does this mean about women having power. So there was a series of ironic, sardonic, kind of not very nice newspaper essays making fun of women who knew too much about politics or tried to claim a role in politics. And Roxana Wilhelmina Pompencrest was an imaginary woman created in a newspaper at the time who was applying to be the doorkeeper of the House of Representatives, and obviously in 1789. And the article just, it makes fun of her, right? Like she's like, well, my hair is very tall, so I know I might not be as imposing as a man, but with my tall hair, like I'm still have an imposing height. And it's all making fun of the fact that like this should never be happening. But here at History Matters, we're campaigning for Roxana Wilhelmina Pompencrest. So anyway, this was the perfect mug. And I have to say, I can't remember who created this. I should have, I was thinking of this as I sat down today and I was looking at this mug. I need a master mug sheet. I need a mug sheet to like list who has sent me mugs in the past. So whoever did this, if you pipe in, I will pipe up. But at any rate, and Matt, he's not here, but he's close friends with Roxana Wilhelmina Pompencrest, and she's on Twitter. So I just mentioned that. Okay. I will stop talking now. Go ahead.
It's an excellent mug, and I do apologize. I have a background. I don't have an elegant green screen like Matt does, but I can briefly pop something up here just so we have something.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Look at that. Okay. Do you know when that's from?
I think this one's 1915. And just to bring it into a new part of time, we had Laurel Thatcher Ulrich at our conference, as you know, Joanne. And she also had just an incredible discussion of women's political power. And there was so much I hadn't thought about in terms of the role of women in the Church of Latter-day Saints and their role in suffrage. And I think a lot about women in the Wilson administration, but I hadn't thought about women in the role of, silver and gold in the 1890s. And one of Laurel's points was that suffrage a lot of times would come down to not like where were men the worst, like where women did or didn't have the vote, but where women tended to get the vote was places where the vote was close and people would want them on their side. And I just,
because there's an advantage, right?
There's this whole layer of just women in politics that I'd never thought about. So it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And I'm so glad that you're talking about this because women have been involved always and forever. Yeah. And I think we do a real disservice when we don't talk about that, because as you're saying, like girls seeing you be a historian, if there's if women, girls in history class never see women being involved in politics, I remember thinking it was really weird that people would show us, I think I even had a placemat of all the presidents, and they'd tell me like, you could be president,
I
and
know,
I'd
it's like,
go,
sure.
can I? Like, I don't see any, and they're like, I mean, it was like it was a weird coincidence that no, there was no women on there.
Shocking.
Um,
Yeah.
So it was like I remember that being very intellectually strange as a kid. So, and if someone had said to me, well, there were systems in place that made that impossible,
Right.
but we always talk about um, it's so important to talk about agency, that actually women were doing stuff. You should know that, little girl. Women have always been participating, even when there were systems keeping them out.
And not only that, but and this is not a new idea by any means, but worth saying, is that when people began to add women into the historical story, add is the key word there. It became additive history, right? Oh, we'll just add women over here, we'll just add people of color over here, but the main narrative is the main narrative. Additive history is like a toe in the water, but additive history isn't enabling all of these people who were engaged in the process to actually be in the middle of the process that they were engaged in. So we've got a ways to go. We've got a ways to go, but improvement is improvement. And to be honest, I hadn't thought about, and sometimes I'm embarrassed to say these things because I feel like I should have been more aware. I didn't think about like representation mattering to the degree that it did. I never assumed, not that I wanted to be, but it never occurred to me that I could be president. It also never occurred to me that I could be a public speaker or in front of people. I don't think I'd ever seen a woman do that. And the first time I had to give a public talk, I went to find women historians speaking in public so that I could see what it looked like, because I wasn't going to sound like my advisors. I loved them, I adored them, but they're like these big men. It's like, well, whatever I am, I'm not going to sound that way. So what do I sound like? So it matters in such profound ways. And I just didn't think of that until the parade of little girls. One of them drew me a picture. It was of me and holding up a book with a little balloon coming out of the book. And in the balloon, it said, I wrote this, which I just love. So anyway, okay, let's open things up to.
We've got all kinds of questions. This is a really important topic.
Cool.
And yeah, the Q&A is filling up here. Do continue putting your questions in the Q&A, please, and I will pass those along to Joanne. So Dale is talking about, he heard you talking about your masthead, your newspaper masthead on the wall behind you. Clementina Rhine's Virginia Gazette masthead, open to all, influenced by none. She published Thomas Jefferson's Summary of a View of the Rights of British America. He wants to know about other women publishers. He thinks you mentioned one in an earlier History Matters episode, and certainly women publishers have a big impact on politics.
Yeah, I did mention one in an earlier episode, and by dumb luck, I was thinking about her this morning. I'm actually, not that long after we finish History Matters, I'm going to be taking part in a conversation on women who should be represented in paintings and statues in the Capitol. And one of the people I thought of was the woman I'm about to mention, because she was very involved in Congress, but she was, she was being sort of edged out and hedged in. Jane Swisshelm is the person who I mentioned before. Jane Swisshelm is amazing. Jane Swisshelm is a reporter initially, excuse me, because she was sort of kept out of what was going on politically. She created her own newspaper. And this was like, I think, one sheet, two sides, but she wrote a biography, an autobiography, and I've forgotten the name of it, but she's a fascinating person. So you could easily find it. It's Jane Grey Swisshelm, I believe is her full name. She talks about how she created this, newspaper so that she could get out in the public and say something. And she said the men around her were like shrieking in panic. And she says, she makes some kind of joke like they all grabbed at their pants, right? So she's like smacking away, she's not shy, Jane Swisshelm. She was the first woman to be in the reporters gallery in Congress. And she did it deliberately. And she explains this, because someone had to do it first. so she was like, I'm going to open the door. Like, I'm going to be the woman who does that, which she did. She happened to be there the day that Henry Foote pulled a pistol on Thomas Hart Benton in the Senate. Great timing. And so she was there, she witnessed the whole thing, and she wrote a piece about it. And it was a piece that was pretty much in line with any other piece. I read it when I was working on my book. But of course, what happens? She's hysterical, a hysterical woman. No one should think about what she's saying because it's like all emotional. It was like, yeah, actually, you're the emotional one right now.
Yeah.
You're responding to her report. So she's great. And she clearly was like feisty, which I think you had to be in her situation. But to get a woman's voice on a major stage and to have it be loud and to speak over the people who are trying to drown you out. I will tweet actually the name of the biography at some point in the next day or so, because she's really fascinating for that purpose. Okay.
And we did have someone in the chat say that the woman in Baltimore, and so I'll fill in, that's Mary Catherine Goddard,
Yes.
is very important, and prints the Declaration of Independence with the signatures, and
yes, absolutely.
And it is the postmaster of Baltimore. So there are just lots of these characters who aren't usually in the narrative that we tell, and they're so important.
Right, and for any number of reasons, right? One reason it has to do, and this is true of people who are not white males, is that the archive is not full of their papers and their thoughts and their writings. So there are silences in the archive that need to be filled that I think people didn't notice the silence, obviously, for a very long time. So that's just as true of her as it would be of anyone else.
And sometimes they're there, but if we don't know that they're there, that's a trick too. If there are women in the archives, but we don't know, if we haven't been telling that story, we don't know to look. So it's very important stuff. Thank you. And I noticed in the chat people are sharing more women publishers and editors. That's very exciting. Thank you.
I'm going to save this right now. I always do that. Okay, chat saved. Yeah, no, that's great. And for sure, folks, if you have things you want to beam into the conversation, throw it into chat. And then questions and Q&A.
Yeah, questions and Q&A, and we have so much interesting stuff. I'm having trouble picking where we're going to go here. We'll stick with earlier. Let's see. This is fascinating from Becky. Did the views of women in positions of power in the United States change after Victoria came to the throne in England?
Huh.
So does Victoria have an influence on women's
right.
participation in politics?
I actually don't have a concrete answer to that. My assumption would be that, yeah, it would have to influence some people for all of the reasons we're talking about now, seeing a woman in that kind of a position of power. Now, it could have had a positive or negative influence, right? I mean, there could have been a defensive anti-women with power response. That's a time period beyond really, most of it is beyond where I go. But I can't imagine there not being a response to that. Even, wasn't there, I read recently in all of the hoo-ha going on about the royal family, there was some like sneering comment about Queen Elizabeth, like, well, she'll never really be in power, like someone else will come along and be in power, not her. But I don't know, actually, I don't know. And, for that matter, what was the response? Go all the way back, Queen Elizabeth. It would be really interesting. I don't study royalty, so I don't know, but that would be a whole different level of not just the kind of power that women display as queens. And I'm sure historians have written much about that, but just the way people respond to that is a good question that I am not equipped to answer right now.
That's when I was teaching, that would be one of my, that's a wonderful question.
Exactly. Oh, there, Kathleen, half a century, I think, Swisshelm's autobiography. Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, but I think that's really interesting to think about. I'm glad folks are asking these questions, and I hope we all research that. What are the transatlantic? We think about women seeing each other's influence across the Atlantic, and
well, there was a historian in England, a woman historian in England, Catherine Macaulay.
Yes.
An American, Washington was corresponding with her. There were a number of American men with power. She was very curious about what was going on, and men were engaging in a correspondence with her about it, which is nice to see. Now, sometimes you see that kind of correspondence and you feel all cheered, and then you see another letter a little bit after in which the guy is like sneeringly, like, I of course responded, and I don't think it's very good at all. But in her case, she got respectful engagement with these men. So it's a really interesting period in a lot of countries. Again, no new idea here, but an age of revolution is an age of revolution, and it means that in some ways, different people are going to be buying into and very supportive of revolution in just different ways. But I think just the fact that it is an age of revolution enables people, or forces people, even better, to kind of open doors a little bit, even if they're trying to close them. They're closing them because they're kind of opening a little bit. So I suppose that age of revolution is a transitional moment. And I said this 1,000 times. I will say the word contingency because I know the people that come here every week expect me to say contingency. But transitional moments like this, when things are in process and are changing and aren't settled and power is shifting, those are moments where anything can happen, and that's true in a good way, and that's true in a bad way.
And Catherine Macaulay wrote A History of the Revolution, didn't she? The American Revolution?
I think she did.
I think she did.
Yeah, I've encountered her mostly in her correspondence asking questions of Americans, but I would not be. Oh, there's Gloria. Thank you, Gloria. She did.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so let me just say that women in the role of historian is an important place of power. So thank you for that.
Actually, I had a student, an undergrad, wrote her senior essay comparing the history of the revolution by David Ramsey and Mercy Otis Warren. And she wanted to see if gender made a difference in the way the story of the American Revolution was being told. And this was a long time ago, so I don't fully remember all of the conclusions that she drew, but I do remember, and this won't be surprising at all, except in the case of a civil war, the revolution matters, was that Mercy Otis Warren was more open to and sensitive to the climate and ethos of what was happening and how people were responding to what was happening, and was engaging with events on a slightly different level. Not at all in a frivolous way, but there was like a level of communication in history that she picked up on as significant in a civil war and worth communicating, that David Ramsey was like, how interesting, a new republic, what shall this be? So at any rate, women as historians too is a major interesting topic.
Yes. And we have another comment here, and you just mentioned this, so whether or not you want to take more time on it, but we just have another question here. That there is a difference between England and the United States, and in the United States, this post-war of independence moment, is there a greater openness for American women because of the revolution and because of the emphasis on Enlightenment thinking? Is that just a particularly notable moment in the world where the door is open for a bit?
Well, yes, and the book I always recommend about the door opening after the revolution, and also the French Revolution, is Rosemary Zagari's Revolutionary Backlash. I taught it this year in one of my courses, and it teaches wonderfully. It's a wonderful book, and the title says it all, which is the revolution opens doors and allows for possibility, and then there's a backlash. Bang, doors are shut. But there was a moment. That's where good old Roxana Wilhelmina Pomp-Crest comes in. The fact that someone had to make fun of her is a sign that actually the door was opened a little bit.
Yeah.
So there was a moment, a recognizable moment that men recognized because they were being defensive against it and aggressive against it. And the Enlightenment also is part of that. In the United States, the revolution was a big part of it, because even boycotting goods that, as a person who was buying goods for a family, a household, that was a political act. So many things that normally weren't political became political. And then with men gone fighting or whatever it was they were doing, a lot of women then gained a lot of control and power over businesses and farms and other things like that they hadn't had before. So it really shifted an understanding, I think, among a lot of women as to what they could or couldn't do. And because there was an assumption that they were politically engaged during the revolution, that they were important as political actors in the revolution, of course, after the revolution, they would assume, okay, now here's the revolution I took part in. So what will now be, how will I continue to be engaged in a republic, new kind of government? And look how great it is. The people, the masses fought the revolution. Women were in the mix. Wow, like what's going to happen here? And there's like this little sad, wavering moment of possibility. And then, as Rosemary Zagari puts it, a backlash.
Yeah, and women briefly voting in New Jersey, some women. And we're getting more mentions of that in the Q&A, asking if the way that women did participate in the revolution, whether it's boycotting or clothing the army or serving as spies, or Deborah Sampson, are these ways that women were sort of seizing power at a revolutionary moment, would you say?
Well, it's definitely a way in which women had power. I mean,
Mhm.
they were making saltpeter. Anyone who's seen 1776 knows that John Adams is asking for saltpeter. So women were creating uniforms. Women were helping to collect money or create ammunition or arms of various sorts. Yeah, I see Gina. Thank you. Saltpeter, John, pins, Abigail. As soon as I said that, the song is in my head. The whole soundtrack to 1776. But at any rate, yeah, women were in all kinds of ways engaged in the revolutionary effort. Let's see if I'm so bad. I always tell my students I'm a historian because I'm bad with titles of books and dates. I'm going to forget the name of the book until it's too late. There's a wonderful book with a white cover. Oh, Joanne. I'll think of it. Women of the Republic. That has Linda Kerber, thank you, Brain, that has a number of chapters in it that address specifically what you're talking about here, which is what were women doing concretely as part of the war effort, above and beyond. And boycotting was one way, but they were engaged in all kinds of other ways too. So the book is a great example of that.
And I think there's certainly a tendency to find these moments that make us proud, but there are certainly things that we look back on now and maybe don't feel quite the same way. So let's see, we've got a number of questions here. I know that one of our board members, Kevin Levin, has talked a lot about women, daughters of the Confederacy, and using political power to influence, actually interestingly, like historians' chairs in universities, and really influencing how the story of the Civil War was told. So just wondering if you could speak to either the Daughters of the Confederacy specifically, or other moments when women have found ways to influence politics and narrative, and maybe not in ways, stories we don't tell as often. Just if you had thoughts about that.
Of women having influence that are well, I mean, one of them I already mentioned, which is the sort of Salon, that was very much copied from what was going on in France. But if you gathered together a group of thinkers, and you were the host of the group of thinkers, and you were the one picking the thinkers to host, that became an environment where you were part of an exchange of ideas that certainly could matter. And that was an environment, because it seemed social, that women very much could be in charge of. I know there's a lot written about that going on in France. I don't know if people have written about that in a way in the United States. I would be surprised if they hadn't. Thank you. Someone said, I saw it in the chat when I said, I don't remember titles or dates. I said, but she always remembers documents. Yes. I always remember primary documents, as much as I forget everything else. But so that would be one way. I mean, I think in a way, and this is a goofy answer, but as half of society, women are part of everything and are influencing everything. And it's just, people haven't wanted to acknowledge that. People haven't seen it. People didn't think it was there, so they didn't look for it. And it's harder with early America. Really interesting when you look, actually, this is a sort of thing to put in the back of your brain when you're looking at scholarship books written about early America. And I always tell this to my students. There are a lot of books that have titles like, there's one, American Manhood, American Manhood. And when you look at the evidence, it's actually New England manhood because most of the evidence, so much more paper evidence was preserved in New England, so that a lot of things that are said to be national and American actually are regional. So it's worth very much, as we're sort of evaluating who is there and who isn't there, to think about who is or isn't represented. And in that case, it's literally because of the evidence. But my students, my grad students, often they know to instantly look for our other parts of the country besides New England there? And is there a mandatory separate chapter on women and Black people? Right, I talked about everything, and now the last chapter, so things that now would be more noticeable, but still that shape the story in one way or another, in an obvious way, and just for so long kept eyes closed. And now, all of us as teachers, we're getting past it, but we need to pass that on to other people too.
Absolutely. And we get questions at NCHE about there's so much we want to cover. We want to cover different groups more. We want to cover women more. Should we have a separate elective? Should there be a separate chapter? And we keep saying they're in there, really. It's part of history. It's in there, and we can incorporate that with our teaching, with our daily teaching. It's not that add-on. Now, so Gloria has an interesting question here, and I think you referenced this a little bit earlier. Why do you think women in politics is so frightening to men? Because they do seem a little scared in some of these documents you referenced.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of reasons, and this is not something I have any great authority on, except women are good at some things that men are not good at, and women, and by that I just mean sometimes they work better in a group. They are more aware of different levels of conversation because they've had to be, because of what they've been offered access to. I think the level of fear of women having power registers the amount of power that women really could have. It's a sign of the fact that women truly are and could be an even greater force to be reckoned with. And that's the fear that men have. Their response, when people are bending over backwards to push people out, that's the surest sign that the people they're pushing out actually already have some power and could have a lot more power. So I think that's some of it. I do think, going back to what I said about Jane Swisshelm, who made the joke, and I wish I could reconstruct it, about she comes out with a newspaper and men are holding onto their pants. There's a manhood component too, right? That men are in charge and men are leaders and men are the ones in control, and that a woman who beams in and says, yeah, I can do that too, is just a huge threat on a personal level too. It demands, to use a word that was used at the time, men. And so even on that level, people don't want to see it, don't know what to do with it. They're much more comfortable policing women. There's in Congress, there was a reporters gallery, and then there was a visitors gallery, and then for a while there was a women's gallery. And women were allowed in the women's galleries. So were men who were there explicitly to protect the women. So the point of the women's gallery was to keep out certain kinds of men, to police, the area around women. That was what that was for. But again, I write about this a little bit in my book, and others have written about it a lot. There are these women, and in Washington, women were highly engaged in the political process. They were watching Congress. They had a lot to say. They were living in boarding houses with their husbands, wives of congressmen. Washington was a city where women had a very active political role and an active political voice and influence in a way that they didn't necessarily in other places. And I do mention in my last book one particular woman, a writer, an intellectual, who says she loves being in Washington because all of that is true there. People there, as a woman, you can just talk about politics, you're engaged in the process. You're not hemmed in. It's different, and that's an interesting thing to think about too. That the national capital, because it was a city created for the purpose that it serves, in some ways allowed that to happen too, in a way that it might not have been, like if, I don't know if it stayed in New York or stayed in Philadelphia, but the capital city of the nation being a place that by definition allows more women to be in the mix all over the geography of power. That's something that's going on too. Actually, Gloria's mentioned Mary Todd Lincoln for sure. Yeah, women upstairs, not downstairs. You guys are great. Yeah, you guys are.
And I wonder if there's something too about. I just wonder if there's something about Washington D.C. being new too. That everybody's kind of creating this city that's may have played into it.
Yeah, it was quirky as far as women, because a lot of congressmen went to Washington and left their wives at home. So it was a weirdly male city, and yet it was a place that welcomed, or at least women didn't necessarily welcome them, but women were part of the political conversation and the political game by being there. So it's an interesting place because it's new and it's unlike a lot of other cities for all kinds of reasons. So it becomes kind of an interesting experimental space to see what people do in that space, and then to see how people respond to what's going on in that space. Like this woman's name has left my brain because that's what I do. Margaret, I'm never going to remember it. The woman who's like, this is great. You could talk about people and politics, and you're in the mix. Someone writes about her and essentially says she's in the mix and she's talking about things and she's very unattractive. Really? like that's all you got. That's all you got, right? She's in the mix. She has things to say. Well, I don't like the way she looks. It's like, okay, that's pretty weak, pretty poor ammunition. But that's immediately, just like people immediately going to the space where they're like, the woman in the gallery, the reporter's gallery, she's emotional, she's hysterical, she's ugly. What are ways in which we can keep women blocked out that other men will buy into? So anyway, I see that we're rapidly running out of time. Oh yes, Newbie. So I didn't want to interrupt our conversation because it was so good, but Newbie has been chirping and oodling throughout the whole thing. Someone just said Newbie. So yeah, I don't know if anyone heard it. I can never tell. I was saying on Twitter yesterday that I did something for BBC News yesterday, and Newbie like happily oodled through the entire interview. But at any rate, we are now going to, as we always do, segue to the after party. What that means is if you are here and you beamed in here through the National Council of History Educators website, you could just stay here and we will stop recording and we will just segue into a less formal discussion about whatever the heck it is we want to talk about. If you're on Facebook and want to join us, you need to leave Facebook, find the NCHE site, ncheteach.org/conversations, and just click on that, beam right in, and you will be part of the after party, which is always fun because the History Matters community is the best community. And I'm not biased at all, but this is a chance to have a different kind of a history conversation. So join us, please. If you don't join us, please come back next week. As I always say, I have no idea what we'll be talking about because the news cycle is so insane, but we will be talking about something. And as I also always say at the conclusion of these conversations, it's so important to have these public conversations, to have this kind of discourse about history and politics and the present. And I'm really always pleased and honored that we are doing that among many others. So thank you for being part of that.
Okay. And at that same website, ncheteach.org/conversations, you can see back issues of this. You can see Joanne talk about lots of other topics. I do want to acknowledge Catherine Flynn, who's pointing out there's a lot about women's history we have not covered today. Absolutely, Catherine.
Oh yeah, and actually let me say 2 words about that, because I did not mean to represent and that's the game. I talk for a half hour and then we answer questions for a half hour. So by no means was I assuming I was comprehensive here, which is why I limited it. I was kind of talking about first ladies, and even that I was covering a little window. But thank you for bringing that up because that's big time true. This was a little tiny opening of a conversation.
We talked a lot of early Republic today, but you can find a lot more at ncheteach.org. You can also, if you were not able to attend our conference, which was 2 weeks ago now, we actually recorded the whole thing. You can still buy tickets to the conference. You can watch the whole thing, many, many breakout sessions, lots of women's history there. We had, again, women like Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and Annette Gordon Reed. You can watch that and still get credit to use in your district so you can still get lots of resources at ncheteach.org for those of you who are interested. So thank you all for coming. I am going to turn us off Facebook and recording now, and we'll have an after party. Thank you all so much.
Excellent.